All right, today we are going to tackle one of the toughest, most ethically challenging topics in the entire Old Testament. It's a subject that, let's be honest, makes a lot of people deeply uncomfortable, and for very good reason. We're going to walk through the theological explanation for the destruction of the Canaanites, based on the source material we're looking at today. And that really gets us to the heart of it, doesn't it? The question is stark. We're looking at texts that seem to contain a divine order for the complete annihilation of a group of people. I mean, how do you even begin to process something like that? The material we're using today tries to build a framework for understanding it from within its own context. Okay, let's just dive right in and look at the verse itself. This is the command from Deuteronomy. The language is absolute, and frankly, it's shocking. There's just no way around how disturbing this is. The question isn't whether it's difficult to read, it is. The question is, what is the reasoning that's actually provided within the text itself? So, to really understand the source's explanation, we first have to clear the air and set aside a really common oversimplification you've probably heard a million times. You know the one, the idea that the God of the Old Testament is just this angry, wrathful figure, while the God of the New Testament is all about love. Well, the source material argues this is just a false dichotomy. It points out that God's grace and love are all over the Old Testament. Just look at Rahab, a Canaanite woman who was saved for her faith. And, on the flip side, divine wrath doesn't just disappear in the New Testament. The source brings up Jesus' anger in the temple and the teachings on hell. So that simple angry God versus loving God idea, it just doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. Okay, so if that simple explanation is off the table, how does the source explain this command? Well, the argument really rests on two foundational claims. One is about who truly owns the land, and the other is about the state of Canaanite society at this very specific moment in history. So the first piece of the puzzle is purely theological. The land of Canaan didn't actually belong to the Canaanites, and for that matter, it wasn't ultimately going to belong to the Israelites either. According to the text, the whole earth belongs to God. So God is presented as the ultimate landlord, the one who holds all nations accountable for what they do on his land. And that includes Israel itself, which, as the source points out, was later kicked off that very same land for its own sins. And the second major point is that this judgment wasn't some sudden, arbitrary act. The explanation given is that it was the culmination of a very long 400-year waiting period. The idea here is that God waited for centuries as the sins of the Canaanite culture just compounded year after year until they reached what the text literally calls a point of completion, a tipping point. And this verse right here, it perfectly illustrates that idea of a tipping point. This was spoken to Abraham 400 years before the conquest ever happened. It suggests a really long period of divine patience. But, it also implies that that patience had a limit and that a moment of reckoning was already on the horizon.
So what were these sins that were so bad they pushed things over the edge? The source material gets really specific here. It wasn't just, general wickedness. The texts cite things like widespread sexual perversion, so-called sacred prostitution as a form of worship, and, most horrifyingly, child sacrifice, a practice that we actually have archaeological evidence for. According to the text, these weren't just everyday sins. They were uniquely corrupting acts at the core of their society.
So all of that brings us to the next part of the explanation. Because this command isn't just framed as a punishment for the Canaanites, it's also presented as a kind of extreme act of protection for the brand new nation of Israel. And to get this, we have to understand a crucial Hebrew term, haram. It's often translated as the ban or devoted to complete destruction. And it's important to know this wasn't just a military strategy. It's explained as a deeply religious act. To put a city under haram meant to consecrate it entirely to God, removing it from all human use, which often meant its total destruction. So why such an extreme measure? Well, the rationale provided is that Israel, coming out of 400 years of slavery, was a really fragile nation with a really fragile faith. The purpose of haram, then, was to create a sort of sterile environment, an uncontaminated space where their new culture and covenant with God could actually take root without being immediately corrupted by the very practices the Canaanites were being judged for.
But you might be wondering, was this command really as absolute and universal as it sounds? Well, according to the source material, if you look closer at the text, you start to find these really important nuances, limits, and conditions that often get overlooked.
And this is a huge point. This was not a standing order for holy war. The source really emphasizes that the command of haram was explicitly limited to a specific group of people, in a specific place, at a specific moment in history. It was not a blanket command for Israel to just go out and conquer the world, and it was never repeated. And here's another really key nuance. Even within the story itself, these seemingly absolute commands weren't always carried out absolutely. The source points out that there seems to be an implicit condition, like repentance or choosing to align with Israel, that could override the command. I mean, look at Rahab, a Canaanite woman who was saved because of her faith. Or the Gibeonites, a whole Canaanite people who were spared because they made a treaty. The implication is pretty clear. If others had done the same, they might have been spared too. So after laying out this whole multifaceted framework, God's ownership of the land, the completeness of Canaanite sin, protecting Israel's faith, and the limited nature of the command, where does that actually leave us? Well, the material makes it pretty clear that this explanation doesn't just erase the profound difficulty of the text. It provides a theological context from inside the biblical worldview, sure, but it doesn't make these passages any easier to read for a modern audience. It remains, without a doubt, one of the most challenging and disturbing problems in all of theology. And that leaves us with this final, lingering question. You see, understanding the ancient context is one thing, but it forces us to ask a much bigger question that echoes right into today. How should we, in a modern world, interpret ancient texts that command religious violence? There's no easy answer here, and it's a question worth thinking about long after this explainer is over.